included some pictures here. And in one of these, you can see the beautiful Earth here compared to the moon. And the Earth is especially beautiful when you compare it to any of the places that we've considered visiting in space. The moon, of course, is dry and dusty, has practically no chance to support life without a lot of effort. And the same is true for just about every place else we've considered. The Earth, however, has not always been so beautiful. This is a plot of temperature and carbon dioxide over the last 600 million years. So this is the kind of the long view. And you can see one of the interesting things here is that the temperature has a flat top in many cases at about 25 C or 77 Fahrenheit. And I got to wondering about that and actually plotted some data. This was taken on July 2nd this year. And I picked coastal locations at various latitudes. And I looked at the high temperature and the low temperature that I could find for the day, and then took an average. And you can see if we look at the averages here, 77 degrees isn't far off of where this maximum is. And I think what's going on here is as the Earth heats, we don't get extremely high temperatures necessarily because of the oceans. The oceans put a lot of moisture into the air as energy comes to Earth. And this modifies the temperature effect. But what happens is we get additional moisture. One of the things that happened in the past was the development of land plants. This was back in the Ordovician, you can see almost 500 million years ago. And land plants, of course, use carbon dioxide out of the air. And so the carbon dioxide distribution came down over time. And we eventually got some low temperatures on Earth. And what was happening, of course, is the greenhouse effect. The sun is a very high temperature. And so the radiation coming from it is energy that can penetrate the atmosphere and the greenhouse gas layers very easily. Very little reflects off. But the radiation that comes from the Earth back up is at a lower temperature, lower energy, because the temperature of the Earth is lower, much lower than the sun, of course. And so much more of it is reflected off of the greenhouse gas layer and is not radiating out to space. Now you can think of this as sitting in a car on a cool day that's sunny. When you're in the car, you can be quite warm, even though it's quite cool outside. And of course, that's the greenhouse gas, greenhouse effect working on you. One of the periods here, the Carboniferous, is when coal was created about 300 million years ago. And that is a time when ice was also available on Earth. You can guess that then something happened called the PT extinction. And that was the largest extinction of species we've been able to spot in our history of our Earth. And the exact cause is uncertain, one possibility is an asteroid. Another has to do with methane that was trapped under the ice and then released as the Earth started warming. And so the changes became sudden. And that's one of the issues really being worrisome right now, is that as we raise the temperature of the Earth, methane that's trapped in the tundra in the Arctic areas could be released into the atmosphere and cause, it's basically like going off a cliff. Dinosaurs lived in the area shown here, and they were wiped out in this KT boundary with what appears to be an asteroid collision. About 10 to 15 million years ago, the sea level was about 100 feet higher. This is someplace in this intermediate area. It's not easy to decide exactly what level the carbon dioxide was at this point, but it was a little higher than currently. This is another source for a similar plot for carbon dioxide, but it also shows the oxygen and shows that as carbon dioxide was down, oxygen was up. Now you realize 1 million years on these plots is a very small distance. Next, I'm going to a plot that's only 400,000 years, so only half of a million years showing. This plot shows the ice age cycles, and of course what's happening recently is carbon dioxide shooting up. I mentioned the Earth was beautiful to us, and one of the reasons is that we were developed for this Earth. We, as Homo sapiens, developed during this last 300,000 years or so. And so we've learned to appreciate the Earth that supported us. You'll notice that during none of this time was carbon dioxide over 300 until very recently. So we're going into a world that's different from the one we developed in. And of course, as carbon dioxide goes up, temperature goes up. Sea level has also risen, and we'll see a lot more of that coming along. Surface temperatures have risen just about over the whole Earth. This is breaking down the various aspects. You can see here carbon dioxide is one of the biggest reasons for these changes. Other greenhouse gases are in this area. If you add up all the human-induced parts, it's this dotted red line. You can see the volcanic effects, occasional cooling. That's not necessarily human though. So it isn't included in this red line. Where does the carbon dioxide go? Well, it comes from, where does it come from and where does it go? The fossil fuels create most of it. Some differences in land use change. Some gets absorbed into the earth as, for example, leaves from trees get absorbed into the ground. Some absorbs into the ocean, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And the rest goes into the atmosphere, which is why we have the warming. This plot shows changes in annual precipitation. Of course, we have the dry around here, and we had a wildfire this morning, burned one house, but we've had much worse. Many parts of the United States, especially Midwest and Northeast here have gotten quite a bit wetter. But what this plot does not show is the extremes, because this is an annual average. The extremes are what has really gotten worse with climate change. This has to do with the ocean. As carbon dioxide in the air increases, then carbon dioxide in the sea also increases because it dissolves. Some of it forms carbonate ions, and that's what leads to the ocean acidification. And you can see the pH dropping here as the ocean becomes more acid. One of the ways that we can understand the changes that are going on is to look at the jet stream. I can remember back in the early 1960s when John Lewis was getting hit on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that the jet stream was kind of a simple sine wave going across the country. And it wasn't as, the amplitude wasn't high enough to reach the borders. It would be only about half of the vertical distance of the United States. Today, you'll see all kinds of different jet stream shapes. The jet stream today is not that extreme in shape. It's just way up in Canada, a lot of it, and that's why we're having such a hot day here in Southern California. The recent Time magazine, July 20 and 27, talked about 2020 was supposed to be the defining year for the planet, and we were hopefully going to get some change that will solve this problem. But then COVID came along and a lot of things got delayed. Greta Thunberg, in one article in there, says that no Green Deal will be ambitious enough to save the planet, and I'll show you some of the reasons for that. Justice for All was a part of it that basically says that the people of color suffer more from climate change and pollution than the rest of us do. I'm sure we can understand that. Now, it would be easy if we had a simple choice like this, where we could choose to put our lunch leftovers in the recycle place or the ruin the planet place, but it's really not that simple. There are many products, and it's very difficult for us to understand how much fossil fuel is involved in the various different products. Of course, something like jet fuel, you can understand, has a lot of fossil fuel in it, but everything on here is using fossil fuel either in production or in transportation to get to us, and even in the stores where we buy it. This plot shows that things we think of, like automotive and gasoline, heating for our homes, air conditioning, so forth, are part of the problem, but indirect emissions that happen someplace that we wouldn't necessarily think of are also quite important. I'd like to go back to the basics now and start with the economics of supply and demand. On a plot of price and quantity, it's easy to understand that supply tends to rise to the right. I grew up in West Virginia where coal mining was important. In fact, my father worked in it quite a bit. And there were places where there was coal that was in thin veins. And those thin veins, a foot or two thick, were difficult to mine. And you could do it only if the price was high enough. And other veins were much thicker. Also, some veins were easier to get to because there was different soft materials over top, and others were deep under the hill and more difficult to get to. So supply definitely has a shape like this where, you know, you can get more supply if you're willing to pay for it, but at lower prices, the supply will be lower. Demand typically goes the other direction, not necessarily a straight line, more of a hyperbolic shape, but I just drew straight lines here for simplicity. For example, if I go to a store and want to buy a piece of fruit, I might be interested in an apple, but if they're expensive and bananas are cheap, I'll buy a banana instead. And the same thing happens all the time where people choose to buy those things that are priced more at the price they are interested in. Supply and demand works very well in many cases. We have enough supply in our stores to provide what we usually need. But there are cases where the market does not capture properly the real costs. And we call those societal costs or externalities. And climate change is because basically we do not pay for the carbon that we pollute into the atmosphere now. If we apply a fee to the purchase of fossil carbon that equals the societal cost, then the market will operate on this real supply curve instead of the current one. And so what will happen is that instead of this operating point, we'll have this operating point. And you can see that not only is the price lower, but the quantity is lower, and so the total cost. And this is really the key to getting away from using fossil carbon. If we have to pay the true cost, we would then find other ways that are better ways to solve the problem. And that leads to the plan that Citizens Climate Lobby has worked out. What happens here is we charge a fee for fossil fuels at the source, and then we return that money to households as a dividend. And we return it all. We don't let the government make any decisions about where it's spent. And the return is done equally so that everybody shares equally in the dividend and only pays the fee based on the products that they choose to buy. So we have a choice of whether to buy the fossil carbon products or others. Now, there are really 4 parts to this program. One is the fee, and the other is the dividend. The third is the adjustments at the border, so that if the United States has this plan and imposes a fee, and China, for example, doesn't, then if I mine coal in West Virginia and pay a fee and then ship it to China, I get the fee back at the border. Or on the other way, if some product is produced in China that doesn't pay the fee, when it's imported, there's a fee added at the border to equal, so that the trade isn't affected. And the fourth part of this is that the fee starts at a low level and then increases every year. And we can keep this fee increasing until we get to the point where the atmosphere is stable. We've found a level where the earth can be sustainable, and then we can stop increasing the fee. And in fact, we might find that we'll be able to decrease the fee in the future. Now, a lot of people support this. I won't bother reading the list. One of them, AOC, is famous for the Green New Deal, but she also understands that getting these externalities, these costs that are not covered with a fee, would be important. Barack Obama would like to increase the cost of carbon emissions with an additional price. And that's better than regulations, he says, and I agree. There was an ad in the Wall Street Journal taken out by a lot of important people, Nobel laureates, chairs of the Federal Reserve, economic advisors, secretaries of treasury, and they were saying that, you know, adding to the price of carbon is the right way to go. Justin Trudeau says it is free to pollute. So we have too much pollution. Starting next year, it will no longer be free to pollute anywhere in Canada. So they're adding a price to carbon to fix the issue. We've had positive reviews from a lot of organizations. The Lunt poll recently asked if it is important that the national climate solution be bipartisan, and that's what is that it is bipartisan. There are supporters from both major parties, and of course the people want bipartisan solutions. In the World Economic Forum, in the past, it was not of interest to look at climate change particularly until in 2019. The top 3 points here were all related to climate: extreme weather, failure of climate change mitigation, and major natural disasters, most of which would be from climate change. In the UK, coal for electricity generation has pretty much disappeared because they've added a tax. In British Columbia, they had basically a fee option for a while that worked very well. They've stopped increasing it, and now Canada's going to something like that on all provinces. In Sweden, the greenhouse gas emissions has gone down a lot more because they've added a price to carbon. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce says the climate is changing and humans are contributing to these changes. And for final points, it's already late. Climate change is here. Today, we've got a wildfire, or 2 or 3 locally. It's an unusually hot day, but in the Northeast, they've had some very serious rain lately. There's a hurricane about to hit Florida, and one just passed Hawaii. We're further along in the chain of hurricanes for the time of year than we've ever been. Climate change will get worse for at least 20 years. If we stopped using fossil carbon today, the carbon that's already in the atmosphere would increase the temperature and cause more serious climate change issues for at least 20 years. We can't solve it without the US federal government. no matter what we do individually and at the states, there is no substitute for something that is done at the U.S. federal level. I think we've seen that in COVID, where the federal government has not been in charge of doing what's needed. I do believe that this act that we've got can be passed in this Congress. If the House brings it to the floor, it could pass with a large margin. First, Democrats wouldn't vote against it. They almost all realize that we need to do something about climate change. Republicans would see that their voters in their districts are going to tell them this is the way to go. This is not something that Republicans have a large reason to not like. It allows businesses to operate the way they want to. It uses the market to solve the problem. If it passes the House with a large enough margin that the Senate will have to act on it, even Mitch McConnell would have to bring it to the floor. And I believe it would pass there with a reasonably large margin. And even the president, I don't think, could veto it before the election. So this is a plan. We like to say there are 5 aspects of it. It's efficient. It's a good way to solve climate change with the least problems. It's good for people, especially the poor, because the dividend they get back is actually going to be more than the fee that they pay. It's good for the economy. The money will not be taken out of the economy, and in fact, studies have shown that this plan will stimulate the economy. It's bipartisan because the revenue is returned to people and the government isn't making the decisions on how to spend it. Republicans can join this, and it's revenue neutral, which really allows the bipartisanship. So with that, I guess I'm ready for some questions. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, so everyone, I know many of you have, excited about the talk and the presentation, the topic in general. So please, if you want to speak out, please click raise hand. Or you can just type your question in Q&A. So we have plenty of time. So please, ask more questions.
Did I actually finish early?
Yeah, a little bit early, but we kind of expect people will have more discussion here. Oh, okay. Jim, there's a question in Q&A. Would you be able to see it from Mr. McLeod?
How long would it take to start having a good effect? Okay, I believe that if we passed the bill and got signed into law this year, we could have the first effect. It could actually be applied probably by the middle of next year. Take a little while to actually get it applied. The first month that it would be under effect, the dividend would actually go out to people before the fee was applied, and so they would have the money to pay for that first month's additional costs. And as soon as people see that it's passed, not only will they realize that they're going to pay more for fossil carbon now, but as it goes up in the future. For example, if you're planning on building some way to generate electricity, if you generate, if you wanted to build a plant to burn coal, that's going to take 30 years to pay off. And in 30 years, you would know that the fee would be prohibitive. You would never go ahead and do that kind of a plan. So I think that effectivity would be fairly quick. You would see decisions change within a year of the passage. Someone wants to borrow some slides. Send me an email, jamesamartin5@outlook.com. What would you hope to see as the greatest beneficiary? Solar, wind, nuclear, re-insulating buildings? You know, the interesting thing there is everything would benefit. And certainly the renewable energy options could be pushed, but I suspect we're going to see the greatest effect coming from changes in use. We would buy smaller cars. We would buy cars that use more advanced materials to make them lighter. Victor says, you think we will be operating all electric vehicle fleets? You know, I can't guess that. Yes, they would use the dividend to pay for the extra cost, but whether they choose to buy an electric vehicle or a more efficient gasoline vehicle, or to use a different approach to solving their needs, instead of transportation, maybe Zoom sometimes. Are there any other alternative forms of energy you believe will help break this dependency on carbon? You know, there are many alternative forms of energy, but the easiest and the most available is simply to do a better job of insulating our homes and avoid heating and air conditioning in the first place. But there is a possibility that a molten salt nuclear reaction would be a very good solution if we develop it. You would avoid having a leftover radioactive waste problem, and it would be much safer than current options. Do the studies indicate that nuclear plant development would accelerate with this plan? I don't really know if nuclear as we currently do it would accelerate. It's possible that what would change is the way we generate with nuclear. Could we make a solar shade? You know, there is the possibility that things could be put in space that would stop some of the sunlight coming to Earth. That would have to be considered, but that's a kind of more difficult thing to decide to do when we start interrupting. And besides, probably the place to put something like that would be at the Earth-Sun libration point, which is pretty far away and hard to control. Instead of uranium, thorium salt reactor, yes, I mentioned that. Fusion is a way off. of course, we've got the fusion reaction going on in the sun right now, so we can, in fact, collect electricity in space and beam it to Earth. And if it becomes more economic, that could actually happen. How much would this affect if only the US adopts the program? Well, you know, the interesting thing about this program is with the export adjustment, the border adjustment, and with what the rest of the world has already started, I believe that the rest of the world would follow the US very quickly. The border adjustment would mean that other countries would see that there's no benefit to them if they hold back when we're doing it. And the stimulation to our economy would be such that they would decide that this is really something that would help them too. Plus, it doesn't cost anything. Basically, it's so easy for the government to do. I think that we would see a lot more of it. Canada and the European programs have started things, but they have not pushed them as far as they need to because we still have not done anything here in the US. Okay, one mentions a discussion of hydrogen, electric power through hydrogen cells and powering vehicles. Hydrogen is a difficult thing to develop, to create. It's expensive to make hydrogen because it takes something like electricity to make it. And even if we got the hydrogen, it's difficult to put gaseous hydrogen in a car enough to power very far. If you try to make it into liquid hydrogen, then you've got additional problems of the cost of conversion to liquid. And of course, we do that for rockets because it's worth the extra cost for the benefits. But I don't think we'll ever see much hydrogen use in cars. Cement, heating limestone, and that contributes to emissions. I don't know the details of cement, but I do understand that there are emissions that are greenhouse gases. And what would happen under this plan is if making concrete is a lot more expensive this way, then we would probably find other ways to do things. If it is still worth the cost to make the hydrogen, we could still do that if we quit using fossil fuels otherwise. Mini nuclear battery mega factory. I don't know how you can make a battery out of nuclear reactions. You can make the salt-cooled reactors. Hydrogen just produces water, yes. As far as the waste of burning hydrogen or using it in a fuel cell, we don't have a problem with the exhaust there. There are numerous bills in Congress which are variants of carbon tax, and some give the money back as dividend, others use some to invest in technology and so forth. I am happiest with the bill known as HR 763, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Plan. That's the one that CCL is pushing. Now, the other plans have some similar aspects, but they have problems. First, if you take some of the money and don't give it back as a dividend, but let the government spend it, you won't get the support of the Republicans. They don't want the government having more money to spend, making decisions with. Now, you may be able to pass something over the objections of the Republicans, but it's much less likely. The second problem on some of these is that all of the money isn't given back as dividend, and that can make the economy worse. It can end up costing the average citizen money. And another issue, what I was trying to get to, is that some of them don't want to give the money back to everybody, to have like an income level that determines who gets the money back. I would rather see it just given back universally to avoid problems with income decisions. How much has the pandemic impacted carbon emissions now and our mindset going forward? You know, we have reduced carbon emissions during the pandemic, but we know that we can't reduce emissions by keeping the economy locked down in the future. We're going to eventually get some way to work around diseases like COVID and get back to an economy that's working at a higher level. And we will get carbon emissions back to what they were and even higher unless we have something done.
May I ask a question?
Type it in the Q&A, please.
Well, I've typed in a couple of the Q&A, but I've been encouraged to raise my hand and ask because we're running out of time.
Okay, go ahead then.
Okay, so you're addressing, first of all, a great presentation. My question is that you are addressing ways to lower the fuel or to put dividends out and make people use the fuel differently and so forth. And I'd like to ask about just addressing the way we live on Earth and the way we use our materials and abuse them, and thinking about, you know, really become conscious of how we're living on Earth and what we're doing to this planet. And I was wondering if you had comments about that.
Well, certainly there are changes that we can make in our lifestyle, and some of those changes would be pushed as we see a carbon fee increasing. I think the first thing we would do is learn how to use less heat and air conditioning, and also less fuel for transportation by doing things more efficiently.
Exactly. So you haven't spoken about those efficiencies or alternatives. You know,
well,
instead of using more fuel or a different kind of fuel, can you address alternatives?
There are many alternatives, and what I'm saying is that the fee, as it increases, would push people to look for those alternatives. If I have to pay twice what I do now for air conditioning, then I'm going to add a little insulation to reduce that air conditioning bill. If I have to pay twice what I do now for automobile fuel, I'll be looking for ways to get my transportation needs reduced or to use less fuel for my transportation. Now, when we talk about lifestyle changes, one of the important ones has to do with population growth. And what I see is we need to keep the Earth population from growing so fast that we can't handle it. And if we don't do something about climate change very quickly, we will find the Earth population falling significantly over the next few years as we get into wars and droughts and lack of having food for many people. And we're seeing some of that already.
Yes, we've just lost 1 million people due to this virus.
And, and whether this virus is caused by climate change or not is something that could be argued, but it is really quite likely that we will have additional diseases in the future as climate change gets more serious, especially things like dengue fever and Ebola that thrive in the tropics and can be passed by mosquitoes. Someone says, would you recommend moving underground or undersea to save on heating and AC? I don't know that those are that important in the way of solutions. There may be some benefits. For example, I've seen designs for homes that are built into the side of a hill where you can get solar heating in from the south and keep the north wind away by the hill.
The time is 1:00 p.m.
I only have 11 o'clock here.
Sorry about that, that's my clock.
Somebody could mute.
Yeah. I have a question though, since I popped up there. Do you think, is there a way that we should
I lost.
Yeah, a way you can extract hydrocarbons from the atmosphere? Would you think, what would you suggest we do if it was a way we could extract and vacuum the dangerous CO2 that's produced, that produces the greenhouse gas effect from the Earth's atmosphere? Is that
There is the possibility that we can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and using alternative energy sources, create a liquid fuel that we could then use in a vehicle. I think that we will probably find that those are things that can happen when the price of fossil carbon liquids gets high enough to pay the costs. And when the cost of alternative energies get low enough to make it worth using them to do that kind of action. There are penalties that you pay in doing that. I see a question here. If all monies are returned, how are the costs of the program covered? And there are some costs of operating the program, and they would, of course, come out of the fees. The costs are, as the bill 763 is written, I believe the limit is 5% in the first year and something less in the future years. I, in fact, think it will be fairly insignificant once it's underway, especially now that the IRS has gone through this paying out the $1,200 COVID payment, which is very similar to this dividend. Question, how do you adjust for supply chain problems and certain products become unavailable due to companies not being able to, let's see, does that go on? Able to produce products at the increased cost of carbon? What mechanisms companies compensate for this? Who decides? Well, like any other economic decision, if a company cannot produce its product, they'll go out of business. If a product is important enough, we will pay a high enough price to get it. And the economy works very well for making those decisions. we don't need to have a government or some other agency tell us, you know, we're going to have a certain product or an alternative product. That's why an economy like the United States has done so well compared to an economy like the Soviet Union did in the 1980s, for example. Would you recommend using heat from the deep planet to power CO2 absorbers? You know, I don't know if using heat to power CO2 absorbers is an efficient choice or not. What I do know is that we can use heat from under the earth to heat our homes through a water-based system. A friend of mine actually did this in the 1960s. He put a well in, pumped water, and used the temperature of that water to extract heat and heated his home with that heat. We can also cool our homes using water from the earth or lakes or oceans. Could you absorb carbon dioxide by fertilizing the ocean carbon sink? Well, you know, I'm not interested in getting more carbon into the ocean because we've already got a problem in the acidification of the ocean that's going to make a really serious problem for the earth. So many people get their livelihood or their food supply from the ocean that I think we're going to have a real serious issue as that food supply goes down. Let's see. I don't see a question that I haven't answered.
Yeah, Jim, I think the Annette, I think she has a question, but she typed in the chat, so you won't see it.
Okay.
Annette, do you want to speak up? Well, basically, the question is, how can the average person do to help the cause?
Say that again. What can the average person do to do what to the cost?
To help the cause. I mean, what you were saying, you know, to help.
Okay. Let me say that what I would like anyone who's interested in this subject to do is, number one, write your representatives in Congress. You have one House of Representatives person and 2 senators, no matter where you live. And if you write to those people and tell them that you want this Bill 763 brought to the floor and passed, then it will help get things to happen. Number 2, if you really want to get involved, join Citizens Climate Lobby. You can Google the name and find local chapters. We have like 6 of them or so in Orange County. And I know there are some in LA County, but I don't know how many. They're all over the country, in fact, all over the world. And we have once a month meetings. Well, of course, we're not meeting in person now. That's just a Zoom. But you can get lots of resources from the CCL website. And you can also learn about the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act online. Yeah, there's an active chapter in Long Beach. I'm familiar with it. When can we expect the deep oceanic circulation to stop after the polar ices completely thaw? You know, I can't predict things like that, but I do know that if we keep warming the earth, we're not going to have much ice left, and it will affect what happens in the ocean circulation. And a sudden change in ocean circulation can change weather significantly throughout the world. These kind of things could be quite catastrophic. Are there other things in the chat that I haven't gotten to? Okay, Paula in the chat says, have you seen the documentary Anthropocene, which came out last year? It illustrates the impact mankind has had on Earth. The abuse of our planet is worldwide, and this film brings it to life. Highly recommend. Available on YouTube and Netflix. I have not seen that particular one myself. I have seen quite a few similar kind of documentaries, and certainly the problems are significant. You address dividends as a way to cut down CO2. What about changing the way we use fossil fuel? What about building with different materials? Transitioning to electric cars. Don't we need to change our values to begin living with CO2 that does not affect our lives? I've been attending lectures on climate change since the 80s. We've got to change the way we live a lot faster than this. We certainly need to change the way we live, but some of us are willing to make changes for what I call altruism reasons. But many people don't know the best way to change. And that's why I put up the slide with the many different products on it. Many people will not make actions that are expensive to them unless they're forced. And if we have the fee applied at the source of the fossil carbon, then those fees will force everyone to rethink what's going on. John Barnes in Mother of Storms said hurricanes will never stop when the ocean surface hits 82 degrees in the polar areas. I suppose that's true. You know, those flat spots in the temperature curve over the last 600 million years, what I think was going on when they were there is that the world was just constantly seeing a huge rainstorm. With this proposal, how do you adjust the rate of carbon reduction change so that it does not negatively impact the economy? Is there some sort of form of feedback to compensate, i.e. adjusting the cost of carbon with input from economic considerations? Well, the great thing about this is when you take the money out in the fee and give it back in the form of dividends, most people come out about equal. The poor come out a little ahead. The rich who, you know, air-conditioned 3,000 square foot homes pay a little bit extra. But it's not a big impact to the economy, and that's why we also urge putting an initial fee in at a relatively modest level and increasing every year. That way, you not only see that you have to make changes because of the changes to your costs today, but you better make changes that will help you cope with the future. And I think that we don't need any additional feedback to compensate, that the feedback will come automatically from the market.
If I may, I have another question to ask, and this has
Okay.
to do with Elon Musk, who has several projects that are ongoing at this time relating to energy and our use of energy. And an example, of course, he's got his cars, the Tesla car. When the real car comes out, the top will be solar panel and collect energy, and the chassis will be battery storage. And he's using that application for houses as well, in which the tiles on the roofs are solar panels, but they're designed like regular roof tiles, so that you don't really notice it. And also the walls of these houses are the battery storage for the energy served. And this is, for example, a progressive way to look at the way we use fuel, how we store it, and how we gain the fuel without disrupting Earth. Perhaps you can comment on that.
Yeah, I like the idea of, dual function products. For example, when you can make a roof be both a roof to keep the weather out and a solar electricity generation system. That's a great way to get benefit in two ways from the same product. And of course, when we put solar arrays on existing roofs, one of the things a lot of people don't realize is that has an additional benefit, that the shading of that solar cell keeps the roof cooler, which not only reduces the air conditioning bill, but also increases the life of the roof. But if we can put them together and make one product do two things, that's great. And putting batteries in walls certainly is a reasonable thing to consider in the future. One of the benefits of the bill we're proposing is that it increases the cost of doing things the old way and makes so many new options economical. I don't know, Musk claimed that his solar roof was going to be competitive economically, and he's also tried to make cars that are competitive economically, but I think they really aren't yet. And I think that the difference, once we see this bill in place, the difference will push us to some of these alternative technologies much faster. One of the technologies I didn't include in my slides that I have been impressed with is something that I saw was under development in Germany. And that is a windmill that also stores water up the stem leading up to the rotating blades. And the idea is that when the wind blows, instead of making electricity, you pump the water up that stem to a tank. And when you want electricity, you let the water go down and generate the electricity, so that you avoid the problem of not having the wind when you need the electricity. I think there are many technologies like this that we will see developed as we increase the cost of using fossil fuels. how can we stop the power companies from limiting the number of solar panels we have on the roof? I don't know the rules there. I have a particular problem myself in that I live in the condominium, and my condominium community owns my roof, not me. So I can't just go up there and add solar panels. There is an issue that occurs when you try to have a homeowner have solar panels and still be connected to the electricity grid. And that issue is that the electric company has a problem. They still have to supply the wires to your home. They still have to send the billing every month. And when you want electricity, you expect them to supply it, but that may be more irregular than the current level. So things like this are an issue that have to be worked out, and I don't know a particularly good solution to that one, but I think that we can, use individually owned solar panels on our roof to help with the situation. And we can also use utility-owned solar panels to create electricity. My husband worked for a company in Sweden called Sweatwhirl that designed a floating wind turbine that had energy storage capability as well. Okay. Yeah. If it's floating on water, of course there's water available to pump up and store. And so that could be useful. Ken, what's our schedule look like?
We still have 5 or 10 minutes to go if you want to comment something. So while we wait, see if anybody has more questions, I'm just wondering if you can give us some comment about, like you were steering this committee, AIAA, propulsion and energy, is anything related to this sector that something could be done in this sector that can help the cause of situation?
I guess one of the things I might mention, since this is an AIAA event, climate change is an aerospace issue. The atmosphere is part of what NASA is charged to oversee. And when I was at Langley, we did have atmospheric scientists on staff. Also, everything that we do in aerospace uses energy, and most of it is fossil fuel energy. We fly a lot of airplanes that burn fossil fuel propellants. As the need to reduce fossil fuels increases, we're really going to have to find a way around this problem for airplanes. Now, there are 2 solutions that I've seen. One has to do with using electricity. There can be electric powered airplanes using batteries for short distances, and it tends to be better for smaller than very large airplanes. The other solution is what I mentioned earlier, and that is to generate liquid fuels not using fossil fuel. And that could start with an energy source that could be, nuclear or solar or wind or whatever. But we can take carbon dioxide out of the air and water and create liquid fuels. And I'm particularly in favor of propane as a liquid fuel, but there are others that can be used. Do we notice a difference in the atmosphere? now that there is less flying during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have reduced the additions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. I don't think we've reduced the total amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere enough to be noticeable. One difference a lot of people have noticed is the clarity. We can see through the atmosphere in places that we couldn't before. And that's because of pollution other than carbon dioxide. But as we burn carbon fuels, we get a lot of other things in the atmosphere. And of course, as we reduce the use of carbon fuels by adding the feed to fossil carbons, we will reduce those fossil carbons and reduce that pollution as well as the carbon dioxide. I'm also involved in rocket propulsion, and rocket propulsion usually is so difficult that we are willing to pay a very high price for the fuel if we have to. So I see that fuels like hydrogen for rockets and kerosene will not increases in the cost of those will not force us away from those in the near term, but sometime in the future, we probably will need to change the way we do things getting to orbit. One of the things that I've looked at quite a bit is the use of tethers, which can be useful in space transportation. Any other questions?
Yeah, Bob turned on his video. Bob, have you something to say?
No, Ken, I didn't. I'm sorry. I just moving the phone around and pushed the wrong button. I apologize.
Oh, no worry, no worry. You're welcome anytime.
I don't see anything else that I haven't addressed.
Just a quick question on something you were just talking about, and that
Sure.
is the fuel for rockets. Any thoughts about solar electric power, which is currently being looked at for in-space travel? But do you see that as a potential growth that does not use nuclear power, say?
You know, solar electric power in space makes a lot of sense. It's a slow way to go. When you want to move something from a low orbit to a higher orbit, or from Earth orbit to Mars, places like that, solar electric makes a lot of sense, but you don't want to do that for people, at least not all the way. Now, I actually worked with a group of students designing a system that used mainly solar electric propulsion to get from Earth to Mars, but the people didn't get on the final vehicle until it was well away from Earth's gravity well. You have to go slowly using solar electric propulsion because the thrust is so dependent on the energy available, and you can only collect so much energy with, you know, even if you have huge solar arrays. Solar electricity really can't be of much use. Solar electric propulsion can't be of much use to getting us to orbit. Even from the very lowest orbits to a more medium orbit, it's somewhat difficult. It's only when we get to higher orbits that it becomes the best choices in many cases.
Okay, Jim, I think the time is almost time. So thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and discussion. And this is certainly a very important cause, and certainly very important, and people will support you, and of course AIAA as well.
And thanks for all the good questions I got.
Yeah, it's amazing. People are really into this. Yeah. Okay, let's thank Dr. Martin again. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Yeah, stay in touch. All right, so we'll move on to our the second presentation of the day.